2001. He was an independent journalist, and he contributed regularly to the Boston Globe and the New York Times, among many other publications. He also recorded for WBUR in Boston, National Public Radio, WGBH, also in Boston, and is the author of The Massachusetts Legacy and Massachusetts 101. Chris, thank you.
Well, thank you indeed, and I appreciate all of you joining me this morning, and very happy to be here to tell you a story about a change, an important change in scholarly publishing, a change that is the first real significant change in scholarly publishing in more than 300 years. And I'm going to trace the path of that change from the very beginnings of scholarly publishing into where we stand today in 2015. And if you can, let's hold questions until the end of my discussion, but I'd be happy to take as many of them as you would like. Not in a hurry, and we have lunch afterwards, so please stay for that. I think the place to start is with copyright, because I am here on behalf of Copyright Clearance Center. We are based in Boston, actually just north of Boston, near a town called Salem that you may have heard of. They call them the Salem witch trials because that's where the court was, where the trials were held. But the actual incidents happened in Danvers, which is where our headquarters are located. And so I have to tell you that our office is haunted. And where we sort of take our inspiration, of course, particularly for students who are studying the law, is in the Constitution. And I think it's important to point out, everyone's always reading from the Constitution these days. I like to try to do that too, but on behalf of copyright, because Article 1, Section 8 is where all copyright law in the United States really begins. And it's probably not an accident that it was in the very first article of the Constitution. Remember, they had to amend the Constitution with a Bill of Rights to allow for freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so forth. But the founders writing the Constitution thought of innovation and encouraging creativity as something essential to the new nation. So Article 1, Section 8 reads, "To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries." Now this covers both copyright as well as patent, but it really is, again, the basis for so much of the innovation that has driven the success of the United States. And exclusive rights and sort of incentive really can mean a lot of things to many different people. So for freelance journalists like myself who ate what they killed, the incentive was to get paid. For researchers, for scholars, the incentive is perhaps to get to a tenure track position, but it also really is at heart about promoting science and the transfer of knowledge from generation to generation. At Copyright Clearance Center, very briefly, what we are about is sort of trying to establish a balance in copyright law. You will see that often the pendulum swings back and forth in copyright from a situation where the rights holders, the authors and the publishers really dominate, to one where users are sort of in charge, if you will. And it's our view that there can be a balance that allows for the incentive to create and publish, as well as it allows for the use of all the information that is published. And of course, a lot of this is changing today because of technology. So for the story today about when authors rule, I think we ought to go back in time just a little bit. And this may be further back than you might have thought I would go, but I wanted to start there because these cave drawings that are found around the world, they date from anywhere from 25,000 to 40,000 years ago. The most recent discovery was of cave drawings in Indonesia that are sort of pushing that outer limit of 40,000 years. We're familiar with the ones in Spain and in France, but they are found around the world. They're remarkably similar. There are common elements in all of these paintings, and we don't really know what they were used for. They could have been decoration on a wall, I suppose. We like to hang paintings on our wall. Perhaps they were putting paintings up on the wall to decorate the cave. On the other hand, it could have been some other significance involving promotion of the hunt or religion. We just simply don't know. We also don't even know, or haven't known, who painted these. And unfortunately, you know, we have that image of the caveman. but someone recently did some research. Very uncommon is the representation of human beings. Usually, you see the animals themselves. And I believe this is, in fact, some of the first efforts at science and transferring knowledge, because apart from showing the hunt, very often these kinds of drawings are exquisitely anatomically correct. These painters were great observers, and they were very familiar with anatomy of the animals that they were hunting. So they would sign their paintings with their handprint. You may have seen this. They would apparently, through like a tube, blow a kind of ochre paint across their hand, and it would leave a negative impression of their handprint. And this is, again, a very common element in all the cave drawings. And so someone recently said, well, wait a minute, we may be able to tell whether those hands are the hands of a woman or of a man, and because of the way that men's hands and women's hands differ in terms of the length of certain fingers. So they went back and they cataloged all of the handprints that they could find, threw it into an algorithm, and as you would imagine, they found that the predominant number of the hands of these painters were women. And I think that's another interesting point to make here, because when we talk about scholarly publishing, one of the things that we really have been struggling with for many years is the gender disparity, and sort of the knowledge that there have been women working in research of all kinds for many, many years, but they haven't received the credit for it. And so sort of start there, because I think it really tells you that not a lot has changed in 40,000 years. Where it does begin, of course, is in 1665. There's sort of a dual credit given to both the English and the French for publishing the first scholarly journals. Remarkable to me is that these journals, the one in London, the Journal of Royal Society of Philosophy, was published the same year of the Great Plague in London, which killed something like, 100,000 people. And in the midst of that tremendous, what we can only imagine would be pandemonium in that city, they were still able to publish the very first example of scientific literature. Likewise, across the Channel in France, at very much the same time, they were doing the very same thing. And the elements of scholarly publishing were there at the very beginning. So there was peer review. There was the whole notion of dissemination and distribution. All of these things were there at the very beginning and were relatively unchanged for the next 350 years. A thing to point out is that the proprietor of this first journal, he didn't make any money at it. That's a very common element as well to scholarly publishing, or has been for often throughout its history. And it reminds me that we remember that Gutenberg is credited with the first printing press. And it's a great invention, really revolutionized the world. We forget that he died penniless. And what I like to point out is that here we are in this age of digital technology, and in newspapers, in scholarly publishing, in book publishing, and everywhere else, they're constantly in search of a business model. What is the business model? How are we going to make any money off of this? Well, technology is like that. It did it to Gutenberg. It provided this tremendous breakthrough, but it doesn't provide a business model. It takes time for people with a business acumen to uncover what will work as a business model. So poor Gutenberg died penniless, but eventually book publishers like Random House have done pretty well since then. So this is my rather humorous notion of sort of taking us from those caves up to the age of open access there, the kind of the rise of the scientist. And I've got a short timeline here that I want to share with you, because it's remarkable how far back this goes, and yet how recent all the change is. The Project Gutenberg, which was an attempt to put onto network computers various books and other journals, that was initiated in 1971 by Michael Hart. It was 25 years ago that Tim Berners-Lee wrote his report for his superiors in CERN that basically sketched out the World Wide Web. And what I love about that is his superior, who he had filed the report with, sent it back to him. Of course, it's printed on paper, typed, I suppose. And he wrote back on the top, vague but interesting. Here we are today with something that was vague and interesting to the very first man who read the report. Since then, of course, a great number of changes have occurred, and they all are driven around this issue of copyright. But in fact, copyright has not changed so much and is really not under threat by the whole drive towards open access. So there is the first book, Digital Libraries, by William Arms, that defined open access in this way, that was written in the year 2000. Resources, he says, that are openly available to users with no requirements for authentication or payment. In that same year, we saw the emergence of PubMed Central, with full-text articles in open access as a complement to PubMed, which had contained citations and abstracts. And what has begun to happen in the year 2000, remember at that point, it's 5 years after Netscape, we're really still in the very early age of the digital revolution. But in academia, the internet had been something that was in use fairly frequently for almost 15 years, perhaps longer. And what many scientists and researchers and indeed philosophers understood was the internet and its ability to instantly distribute information was going to transform everything in academia and really everything in the world. As Catherine mentioned, I am host of a podcast series called Beyond the Book for Copyright Clearance Center. And so much of what I'm going to tell you about is often based on discussions and interviews that I have with the people who are making these discoveries and changes and sort of doing the innovation. I don't make the news, I only report it. And so I've spoken with Peter Suber, who is the author of a book called Open Access, which was published by MIT Press a couple of years ago. And he was a fellow at the Harvard Berkman Center for the Study of the Internet. And when we were speaking, I said to him, what's interesting to me, Peter, is that although we think of open access as being really very much about scientific literature, he was not a scientist. He was a philosopher. And it was really an interesting point for him. I saw him light up when I asked the question, because this is about the philosophy of information. We hear that expression all the time, information wants to be free. And what we forget, too, is that Stuart Brand, who said that, continued his statement. He said, information wants to be free, but then he said, information also wants to be expensive. And what Stuart Brand was thinking of at that moment wasn't free, no charge. He was thinking of free in the way that so many academics and philosophers would think of, which is freely distributed, freely available in a way that information ought to be. And when I spoke with Peter Suber, we were thinking about that, and he used an interesting term. He said, ideas and information are something that he called non-rivalrous. I'd never heard that expression before. But what it meant was that if I share an idea with you, I'm not diminished. I don't lose anything. You gain something. Thomas Jefferson had a sort of an analogy for that. He talked about information is like lighting a candle for a friend. Your candle continues to burn, but now another person has some light as well. And so that's what many of the people who were at the very beginning of this incredible revolution were thinking about. They were thinking about freely distributing information. They weren't thinking about making it free, no charge. And so that's why it's important to make some distinctions around the related issues of copyright. Now, you're familiar with this copyright symbol, I'm sure, but this is the copyleft symbol. It's looking left, and really does sort of turn copyright on its head. And if you're in publishing, certain people kind of grit their teeth about all of that, because in that whole movement of copyleft, they see an upending of their business models and the end of all those fine lunches and nice restaurants in New York City. But that's not really what copyleft was aiming at when it was thinking about the future. What it was talking about, and what so much of open access is about enriching the public domain. Now, the public domain is every bit a legal term, but it's also a kind of a cultural term. We think of the public domain in terms of copyright. That's material that has either fallen out of copyright, so it's expired, the copyright term has expired, and it is now in the public domain, or it's material that never was in the public domain. So in the U.S., that can be the publications of the U.S. government, for example. So that's the public domain. But what the copyleft movement really worked to encourage was enriching the public domain purposefully, thinking about ways to provide information so that the access was uninhibited. Again, information trying to be free. And right around the same time, again, no coincidence at all, a certain candidate for president, no, not Trump, and not Bush, not Hillary Clinton either, but Lawrence Lessig, you may have heard of, professor at Harvard University, was the creator of something called the Creative Commons. I don't know how familiar you are with Creative Commons, but you're probably familiar with seeing occasionally on some website or a podcast or a video that this, or even on Flickr, that this particular image or film, whatever, can be shared using a Creative Commons license. So Creative Commons licenses are also created to, written so that they enable sharing. In the sort of apex of copyright itself, it's the whole notion of all rights reserved. Under Creative Commons licenses, it's the notion that some rights are reserved. And so the authors, provide you, the reader, the viewer, the listener, with the right to use the material. They retain some rights themselves, but they have made it possible for you to go about using this material without requiring that you get further permission from them. And I think what's interesting about that, and it will come up later, is that copyright has always been about permission. If you wish to reuse a certain image in a presentation, or if you wish to use a song in a movie you're working on, you'd better get permission for that, because if you don't, ultimately that film you've made won't get distribution because the right has not been cleared. And permission is the key there. But again, when I said at the beginning about the Constitution, incentive is not always about money. And permission itself is also not always about, oh, you have to pay me a fee. Permission is often just that, a courtesy. I permit you to do something. You're free to go about it. And I can say at Copyright Clearance Center, we have something like, it's approaching 750 million different works in our catalog. I don't know what the number is, but I looked about 10 years ago into all of this, and of the individual articles that were enrolled by authors, more than half of them carried no cost to reuse. But simply the author involved wanted whoever was the user to request permission, and they wanted to have the right, they wanted to retain the right to say yes or no, depending upon the particular use. So all of these things are happening at the beginning of the millennium, and really driving open access, and this is the internationally recognized symbol for open access. But things take time. So as I say, you are looking at the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002, kind of following on all of this. And various governments become involved. This is a very interesting element of open access and what's driving this change. Because funders, they can be funders, the US government, they can be funders, various private organizations in the United Kingdom. The Wellcome Trust, which is a multi-billion-dollar funder of science research, has really seized on this notion that the benefits of research should be available to all. And so what they have done is made requirements. If you receive a grant from the Wellcome Trust, you must make the material available in some form of open access. And so if you think about it, this is again that enormous change that begins to happen in scholarly publishing in an environment that had never changed for more than 3 centuries. So the way it was done, libraries like this one paid for a subscription. They put the journal on the shelf. Researchers came in and read it or requested it from the stacks. Some people made photocopies. That was the extent of it. With digitization, the material suddenly becomes online, available to people. There were paywalls. There were various ways to sort of hinder the access. But what the people who were funding the science research, and it is particularly in science research you see this, recognized was they wanted to see that the benefits of that research made available as far and as widely as possible. So it introduces an interesting element. You've got up to that point, publishers really in control. I mean, to some extent, the libraries and the people who were purchasing the subscriptions in the corporate world, they had some control too. Certainly they could pay or not pay. But the publishers were in charge. But what we begin to see is funders becoming involved and the authors themselves, the authors recognizing that they were the original source of the material and that the tremendous distribution power, the channel, if you want to call it in terms of business, that the internet offered them really put them in the driver's seat. And we'll see more about that in just a moment. But academic authors particularly, like lots of elements in academic culture, move slowly. So in terms of responding to all of these changes, there was this moment where, sort of a great flare-up of news. The potential of the internet became obvious to everyone at the beginning of the last decade. And like what happens a lot of the time in lots of news stories, the interest fades off. It doesn't go away, but the interest fades off. And indeed, this is what happened. And it wasn't until only a few years ago, relatively speaking, in 2012, that in the UK, that funder I mentioned, the Wellcome Trust, and the British government really began to sort of say, hey, wake up authors, wake up publishers. We said we wanted this done. We weren't kidding. We're going to make it a requirement, and we're going to withhold further funding to you unless you begin to respond. And this really changes the environment particularly, just everywhere. So even most recently in China, just last year, the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, announced that they were moving forward on an open access policy for their scholarly publishing. And what's important there is that the UK represents something like 6% of all scholarly published scholarly articles, I should say. So it was punching above its weight at that point and really kind of driving this change. The US is about 24%. What's critical here is that the Chinese publishing market is about 18% of STM articles published and growing. And the Chinese government is not only encouraging and incentivizing its scientists in China to publish in journals around the world, and if there's going to be a requirement to pay article processing charges, the government is going to pay for it. But it is also supporting creation of domestic Chinese scholarly publishing as well. So while we have seen so much of this come out of London, I predict that we're going to see much more of this driven not only by China, but by the other emerging economies outside of North America and Europe. Just some numbers. Again, we're talking about tremendous change that's being driven by a fairly undersized part of the marketplace. These are numbers from Outsell, a research analyst firm. We recently had a presentation at Copyright Clearance Center with them. The entire scientific, technical, medical publishing market may be something like $26 billion. That's a global figure. The journals market is a subset of that at about, well, I guess about a quarter, not quite. And the open access market is even a smaller subset of that. So I want to show you those numbers to give you some perspective. What we are seeing is a change being driven really, how can I put it? It's punching above its weight. It's in a world, what we imagine, let's say, the asteroid hits, those dinosaurs look up and say, what was that? And underneath them somewhere is that little rodent that winds up evolving into all the mammals and everything, including us. And the dinosaurs had no idea, and they certainly wouldn't have suspected any tiny creature of being capable of sort of, beginning, taking over the world in the way that they controlled it. Even further, what's interesting is the way that open access is becoming a business. And this has an impact on authors too, and how authors themselves are going to behave in the future. So what this number is showing is sort of the growth from 2013 to 2014. And I don't know if you could see it very much, but PLOS, Public Library of Science, which is the very first and probably the leading open access, native open access journal, I believe began to publish in 2003. But you can check me on that. It was at one time, it kind of owned the show. What's interesting here is that Springer, the German-based STM publisher, has clearly sort of taken the lead. And I think quite aggressively so, by doing something that would have been unimaginable in the year 2000. In 2007, Springer purchased Biomed Central, which had been the original scientific repository, journal publisher. And when Springer sees an opportunity in a business way to do that, they didn't do that out of the goodness of their hearts. They were looking for a business opportunity. And so it is that, and again, other publishers which you'll recognize, Wiley, for example, you see the open access revenues there growing quite dramatically just in a single year. Elsevier as well, the giant Dutch-based publisher. So again, further numbers, this gives you a distribution of the types of journals that are out there. Subscription only in orange, hybrid so-called, which combine both subscription and where the author is required to have the Gold Road article processing charge. They're able to do that within the existing subscription. And then there's the pure OA. So the pure OA stuff is still a fairly small part. And I think it's important that, as someone I spoke with, Joe Epstein, who's an industry analyst, pointed out, this is kind of like going from Woodstock to Wall Street, right? You know, a lot of people who are big-time analysts making lots of money. At one point, they were college students and kind of dressed pretty funkily and all the rest of it. But at some point, they decided to get into the money game. And this is what has happened in open access publishing. It began as a revolutionary movement, but has become largely domesticated by these large established players. And Peter Suber would agree that it's important for publishers to experiment, to try to find ways to survive in this new environment. So that's why I put this up as a kind of a moment to pause and to say, as much as you may have heard that open access is a revolution, is changing publishing, is going to destroy publishers, is going to end the system as we know it, that kind of prediction, like so many predictions, are very difficult and probably unlikely to actually be realized. So what we have is an environment where people have said, okay, we can have open access and we can have our business too. But what that business is going to rely upon in the future is the author. In STM publishing, the so-called article processing charge, the APC, is how open access is going to be possible. So what that means is that you know, if we're going to lose the subscription, the revenue that comes from the subscription, the publishers have said we need to have revenue from somewhere. And that makes some sense because, of course, scholarly publishing, it not only requires peer review, which must be managed, but it really does have a quality issue. And so many journals, so many scholars rely upon the quality of the information being available and sort of and knowing that if I read that in Nature, I can sort of take it to the bank that that's been thoroughly researched, it's been peer reviewed, that it is coming from accredited researchers from accredited universities and so on and so on. And the way that that's going to continue to be possible in a world without journal subscriptions is through the article processing charges. Now, if you need any further evidence of that, an organization called the Association of Subscription Agents has disbanded. Now they're trying to remake themselves. They're trying to put together a conference in the UK called Researchers to Readers. And I think that's evidence of that shift that I'm talking about. And what it is doing is creating a world where the author is the customer. The author, as I say, authors rule. Why? Because the customer is always right. Publishers are going to need to respond to the expectations of the authors. The authors themselves are going to start thinking about value for money. What am I getting if I am paying a fee to publish in this particular journal? And those fees can be substantial. In some of the STM publishing, some of the STM journals, those fees amount to $3,000. They will range, and depending on the model, from $1,500, I believe is roughly where it's at today in PLOS. There's a new journal called PeerJ, which is trying to create a subscription model. So you become, if you will, a member of the PeerJ community, and that allows you to publish a certain number of articles per year. So there are different models there, but the article processing charge, really any of them, means that the author is the consumer, is the customer. And that means, therefore, that the way that we look at journal publishing is going to actually not be journal publishing much longer. It's going to be article publishing. It is about the article now, not so much about the journal. And when it is about the article, it is about the author. And I say author, but as you're probably aware, increasingly journal publishing is about authors. There are multiple authors. So many articles today carry with them a long list of contributors. This is creating a complication itself, because who's responsible, which part of the grant funded which part of the research, which is then mandated to be published in open access. All of these are challenges that have yet to be worked out. But essentially, as a report from the STM Association uncovered, what we are seeing is what they rather cutely called a new ecosystem. So that publishing ecosystem has moved from that journal-level editorial board view of things into that individual, they would say, although I guess that is contradicted by the fact that there are multiple individuals publishing today. And what that means, though, is, frankly, whoever is footing the bill wants individualized attention. And in the digital world, we may work in a research environment, we may work in a library in the university, we may work in an office that's haunted in Danvers, Massachusetts, but we all bring to our work environment the expectations that we have gotten from being at home with our iPad or our notebook or whatever it is, and ordering things on Amazon, downloading music from iTunes, watching video on YouTube. All of that kind of trains us to think about the digital environment in a way that really is a tremendous shift, and publishers have never had to face before, and authors really have never been in that position before. The authors contributed their work, they gave up their copyright, so they had to sort of hand all rights to the journal publishers. They did not expect or ever receive remuneration in the scholarly environment. As a journalist, as a book author, I needed an advance, I needed an article payment. But journal publishing has never been about paying the authors. So now publishers are asking themselves, well, how can we survive in this environment? What do we need to do? What are the services that authors are going to expect from us? And what happens then, too, and this will drive something very important in just a moment, is that funders, again, are playing an important role. They understand that price is a factor. They don't have unlimited funds. So those article fees that you see today at $3,000 per article are likely to begin to drop, and that is indeed what we see happening. Funders, though, also want to be sure that they get, as they like to say in the UK, value for money. And that is driving the way that authors behave, too. Publishers need to be sure to ensure their brand. Impact factor has been such a critical thing in scholarly publishing for many, many years. And if you're familiar with it, it is the rule by which authors live in the scholarly publishing environment, because if a journal has a high impact factor, that's where they're going to contribute or submit the article. And what's interesting about that is that that impact factor standard was first imagined almost 50 years ago as a way for librarians to know what to buy. it really wasn't about the quality of a journal. It was really just to know how many citations, what were researchers, what were scientists reading. That's what librarians wanted to know, and that was what they meant by impact. But it eventually became a kind of commercial standard, a kind of a commercial. It had a commercial connotation to it. It began to mean quality, and so the journal was what was sold. But if it's really about the article, that emphasis on the brand moves down a level. It moves from the journal, whatever it is, the journal of science of the left hand, down to the contributors that are in, sort of providing the material that journal relies upon. So in all of this environment, the question then becomes, what is it that authors want? And I'm not a scientific author, but I can say, speaking to my own experience, that what authors have always wanted is to be heard. They want to contribute. They want to turn up the volume and sort of get some attention, get some notice. Samuel Johnson said, nobody but a blockhead ever wrote for anything but money. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's certainly true that authors are looking for some kind of return on the investment that they have made, all of that research, all of that effort. So where do they go to get the attention? They go to Twitter. And academic Twitter is a fascinating area that has begun to be its own sort of subject of research. And I'll just share with you some numbers that an ongoing study at the University of North Carolina has come up with. It's still true today that according to their fairly limited survey, only 1 in 40 academics actually tweet. And they tweet about 5 times a week, which doesn't seem like much, and certainly wouldn't keep up with some of the big tweeters out there. And the majority of those tweets, according to the survey, are unrelated to work, meaning their academic research. But it is clear that the potential of tweets, of Twitter, is tremendous in academia in a couple of different ways. First of all, as we've said, the basis of scholarly publishing is sharing information. And what better way to share than on Twitter? And there has begun to be people tracking citations on Twitter. Now, that really changes the whole notion of what impact factor means, if suddenly we're going to have to take into account the number of tweets. But there are researchers who, in the course of their own reading, come across an article and say, that is a really important piece for me, and I think it'll be an important piece for my colleagues around the world. I'm going to tweet it, and they tweet a link to it. So those kinds of Twitter citations are growing, and they're important because researchers tell us that there's this tremendous amount of published material out there. Nobody can get through it. I read recently that something like 1.5 million scholarly articles are published each year. You couldn't, if you sat down and tried to read all of the journals just in your own field, read everything. So what you rely upon are your colleagues. And those colleagues can be university colleagues, or they could be colleagues at a university in Sydney, Australia, or Cape Town, South Africa, or wherever they may be. They are letting you know that they found this important. And that really helps them do the sort of, it saves time. It's the curation that we hear so much about. The other aspect of Twitter, though, of course, all of these things have positives and negatives, is Twitter can be something of a call-out culture. We know what happens in Twitter. It's a way to expose something that we think is outrageous or inappropriate, or students tweet about their professors when they say something they don't agree with or think is dumb. Other colleagues in academia also sort of tweet to call out their colleagues. So it is a double-edged sword. It's also an area where there's a potential for humor and for learning. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this particular tweet, or tweeter, can we call him that? I know I'm being recorded, so you may have to bleep this out, but the full name of his handle is Shit Academics Say. And he is a researcher in Canada. His name is Nathan Hall. And he tells us in an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education that he began to tweet as a way of procrastinating. You know, he had to engage himself in this enormous research project. And if you ever have had to write anything, whether it's a 5-page paper or your PhD thesis, what's the last thing you want to do? The last thing you want to do is write that thing, whatever it is. So you come up with something. In the old days, you lit a cigarette. Today, you tweet. I don't know. It's that sort of thing, right? So this particular fellow decided that he would begin to sort of contemplate what, his reaction as a sort of humorous academic would be. And I can share with you some of the things. He says, I'm not procrastinating. I'm actively engaging in the disruption of traditional academic narratives via social media. Now, I guess that's a sort of an academic humor, but you have to understand that he says, if you can't say something nice, say it as a question. What happened to him? Well, I can tell you that this began to take off, and I've got some numbers for that. He is, let's see, it's grown to over 122,000 followers, gaining 250 to 300 new followers daily. I suppose that's going to be everybody in the room today. Tweets sent from his phone or while he's waiting outside his 3-year-old's ballet class are now showing up in 10 million Twitter streams and generating 200,000 to 300,000 profile visits a month. There's something called follower wonk, which is a metric to measure Twitter feeds. Shit academics say gets an 84. Harvard gets a 78. The University of Oxford gets a 77. And the Chronicle of Higher Education gets a 70. So he scores higher in follower wonk measurements than Harvard or the University of Oxford, which if we were going to name the 2 greatest universities in the world, those are the 2. Now, I point this out because what began as an experiment in procrastination, as kind of a joke, turned into real research. He has 122,000 followers. He actually is a researcher in social culture, particularly the impact of technology. He has recruited participants in studies. He's recruited fellow researchers via his Twitter feed. He's created a graduate school course, based upon his experiences as a leading tweeter in the academic field. So it really has begun to be what he didn't intend it to be, which is a source of research, a source of community. It went beyond the kind of the jokes you would say at the water cooler to something far more substantial. And then there are Twitter feeds like this one, which you may have seen as well. Kim Kardashian, I think is how you would say that, where this is 188,000 followers by an academic. It's a mashup of things that Kim Kardashian says with things that Søren Kierkegaard says. So on the art in St. Bart's, realizing we are just as deceived by the joys of life as by its sorrows. So Twitter in the academic world does have a sense of humor. The other thing that has really made a change and really puts authors in the driver's seat is blogging, of course. Now, blogging isn't as exciting or as followed as closely today as it once was, and certainly not followed as closely as Twitter is today. But it is seeing a bit of a resurgence because, again, it is about authors in charge, creating community, sharing information. It's where they can put the material that doesn't get published. Under the old environment, it was all about the final product, that article. But so much of the work that researchers engage in is far larger than just the finished article. And where do you put all of that? This is a serious question. And so blogs become a way to put that material to further use. You can share not only what your data is, you can share the paths of research that didn't work out. All of this is really critical, and blogging tools enable that. The other place where scholars are really changing things and really upending the publisher's control of the environment is through various so-called scholarly collaborative platforms. You may be familiar with academia.edu. with ResearchGate. I put up Mendeley as simply one example among the several that are out there. And I don't know if anyone here is enrolled in any of those services. Are you? I believe ResearchGate is the one that's got the greatest number of enrollments, something like 6 million, with something like 1 million active users. And in London last year, we put on a program, Copyright Clearance Center did, taking a look at the impact of these platforms on scholarly publishing. And I had a chance to interview a really wonderful researcher, a PhD in a very particular part of biological research, who really was very revealing in terms of what these particular platforms are doing. And so I want to rely upon what she said, not what I've read, to tell you about how scholarly platforms like this are, again, further driving the control into the author's hands, because it's on these platforms that authors can post all of their work. It's sort of blogs on steroids. It's a way to communicate within a kind of a community, to share that material, but it does challenge people to think about how much sharing is appropriate. As this researcher told me, you know, she's applying for grants. She doesn't want to give away the particular discovery or even just what direction she's going, because the competition is tremendous. What we've been told is that something like of the graduating PhDs today, only 15%, so what is that, 1 in 6, can expect to find a tenure track position. So the rest of the PhDs, in the scientific world at least, and probably that's true as well in humanities, are going to have to be looking for alternate forms of employment. So they're really relying upon these platforms as a way to communicate who they are, to tell the research world about themselves. But it's a challenge, because how much do you tell? I mean, in a sense, these platforms are Facebook for scientists, Facebook for researchers. And that's the question we all face on Facebook. You know, how much is TMI? Do we want to put those pictures up? Do we want to make our page available to the public, or do we want to sort of tweak all those privacy settings? And this is critical to the scientific world. But science sort of faces that challenge, and researchers do, because they want to share. And they want to assist others. But, you know, they have to go onto these platforms because the grant applications are driving that. The grant applications today ask you to talk about the impact you're making. And it's not just the impact you're making on science or on your own particular field, but the impact you're making in the public environment. That's really critical. So you have to demonstrate you have a platform. I mean, I'm trying to imagine today, I mean, in the book publishing world, they talk about a platform. And what that means is you just can't come to them with a book proposal. You have to come to them and say, well, I've been blogging on this topic for the last 5 years. I have so many page views a month. I have 10,000 Twitter followers. My Facebook page has 3,000 friends, so on and so on. And that tells the editor in the book publishing house, wait a minute, this is a built-in audience here. This is somebody I can rely upon to sell books. It's an analogy to what the environment is in the grant world. People who are making grants with limited resources want to know that they're giving the funds to people who are actually deserving of them, who are going to make something of those funds. Altmetrics, I understood that there's been a presentation recently on Altmetrics here in this very room. What we are seeing here again, this term is about article level metrics. Although I think I first heard it and I thought it meant alternative metrics. It does mean both, actually. And you may be familiar with the Altmetrics donut there. It's actually, I guess, kind of a French cruller or something, I don't know. Or else a very colorful rainbow covered Dunkin' Donut. What it is measuring is all those things beyond the impact factor. All those things that didn't get measured before. And authors want to see that happen because they weren't getting credit for that before. You might, as a researcher, attend conferences, contribute a paper to a conference. You might be doing work in all other areas beyond journal publishing. But up until recently, the only way that you were able to share with your tenure review committee how much you had done was whether or not you'd published in these particular journals. Today, these alternative metrics are all about everything else you do. And it is a challenge. I have a fascinating interview in Beyond the Book with a woman who is professor at the Indiana University of Bloomington, Cassidy Rose Sugimoto. And she has done a number of really sort of rigorous research efforts to look at the effectiveness of altmetrics and what is actually happening out there. And she raises a number of important concerns. And I would say the first one is that she says altmetrics, all these other ways of measuring the impact of research, they're well-intentioned, but they're ill-applied. She is concerned that particularly there's a kind of gamification going on. Now this happens in the Amazon world. Authors, they publish a book, and then they tell all their friends, hey, post a review of my book on Amazon, would you please? And make sure you give it 5 stars. Well, that's a kind of a gamification of the Amazon environment. There's a gamification of the altmetrics environment that is going on as well. And that really does raise the question for authors, and it's a challenge I think that authors need to take up, because otherwise there's a chance they won't be taken seriously, is does attention mean influence? Now, Kim Kardashian has, I don't know how many millions of followers on Twitter. Does she have any influence on anybody? It's hard to say. Perhaps on some parts of fashion. But beyond that, I'm not sure. She has a lot of attention, but she may not have influence. And these are the questions that are important to ask. And it is, however, still being driven by those funders looking for some way to know that the money they're spending is being well spent. And I guess the other question that Professor Sugimoto raised is that what's attractive about all of this is what really made scholarly publishing so frustrating in the past. It took a long time to publish an article in the past. There was peer review. There were publishing schedules, and you might not see, even if an article was accepted, you might not see it published in Nature for a year or longer. Today, of course, internet publishing allows us to post things immediately. And there's a kind of a sense that altmetrics is about knowing where we stand today, not knowing where we're going to be before the tenure review committee 2 years from now. And so that really does make it very attractive, but there are perils there. And it's, again, finally, Professor Sugimoto's conclusion that the more these kinds of things are being used, the more susceptible they are to corruption. So as you hear about altmetrics, I would just sort of raise a flag for you to think about how really telling any of those measurements are. Does it say that my colleague is doing well or just doing well on Twitter? Finally, I'll end with a warning. Open access publishing has created an environment where, beyond the gamification I was just telling about, there's the potential that you can become a victim. You may be familiar, there's a man, he's a librarian at a university in Colorado, Jeffrey Beal. This is now famous as Beals List. He took up this as a kind of a personal, sort of Don Quixote-like challenge because he became aware that there were journals soliciting contributions from scholars, and they really weren't credible journals. They were simply scams, many of them coming from the same parts of the world where we get those emails about the amount of money in the bank. If you just help me transfer it, I'll give you 10%. So he has begun to do a thorough effort at sort of calling out all of the journals that are out there, looking for easily susceptible authors. Because after all, if the environment is so competitive, if you are working so hard to get ahead and you really want to see your article published, and it really doesn't matter to you where, somebody comes along and says, I'll publish that for $1,000, you might be willing to take that offer up. And so if you ever do submit to any open access journals, apart from the ones you know very well, you might want to check it in Jeffrey Beals List, which is online at scholarlyoa.org. Well, that's my story about the environment and the way that it has changed, sort of putting authors in charge. And again, it's really like, I just bought a car. And the last time I bought a car was 12 years ago. And you had no idea what the real price of a car was 12 years ago. You had whatever was a sticker on the window and whatever it was you could possibly negotiate with the guy at the dealership. Today, of course, all that transparency that the web provides really changes things. It puts you, the consumer, you, the car buyer, in a position of power that you weren't in 12 years ago. The same is true for scholarly authors. They are in a world now where they are in the driver's seat, where they have the power. But with that kind of power comes responsibility, as was it Uncle Ben said, or was it somebody else? It was probably somebody else. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I was interested in your comment about the journal or the publishers are going to have to demonstrate that there's value in what they're doing in this new model. And I've been on all sides of it as author, reader, editor, and it's really elusive to me what that value would actually be. I mean, in the old days, if somebody was making the editor, printing something, binding it, and mailing it around the world, I kind of got how they needed some money for that. Anymore, it seems to me they do virtually nothing, and you mentioned peer review, but the reviewers aren't being paid. Same journal I used to work for used to pay me as an associate editor, now pays nothing. The authors are being tapped for the money, they're not getting anything. What is the publisher adding in value that's worth such an extraordinary fee?
Well, you'd have to ask them. I don't want to try to defend them. I wouldn't put myself in that position. But I know that they, from the conversations that we've had, every year Copyright Clearance Center holds what we call a town meeting in Frankfurt for the Frankfurt Book Fair. You can find those online at Beyond the Book. And we ask these questions. And I would say they still say that the issue comes down to quality assurance. But they are looking at other ways to, open up the data that is published to make it available to researchers. There's a whole field of text and data mining that publishers are seeing opportunities in. And, I think that the value may be obscure to authors, but it certainly is perhaps clearer to the readers, to the librarians, and to others. Because even in this environment, librarians still have to make choices about what they're putting in collections. And so I suppose, not just impact factor, but, some of these other measurements are helping them to answer that question. It's an ongoing one, absolutely. And experimentation is going to be the rule for some time to come. But I mentioned the STM Futures Labs, which kind of looked at this question and sort of came up with that idea of the author ecosystem. They just had a conference here in DC in April, and I moderated a discussion on that. And it has gotten to the point now where publishers are being expected not only to publish the finished article, but all the material that goes with it, including and possibly up to the laboratory notebook. And that kind of responsibility to manage all that information is probably something that does justify some remuneration. Yes?
I've noticed recently something as an author, right? And I submitted a book proposal and it was accepted. And then one of the things that I was told is that I should actually attach bibliography to every single chapter. Instead of, in the old days, there was one bibliography, cumulative one. So now they wanted it for each chapter. So my suspicion was that probably they want to compartmentalize and to commodify each chapter to be able to sell it, as you just listen to a clip on YouTube, right?
Right.
So, I have a lot of suspicion with regard to the publishers' intentions, right? They are known to make a lot of profits, right? And they have been very greedy, let's put it frankly, and openly, So I'm not that convinced that that their, You know, they're just now working in a new model, and they're smart enough to try to adjust the model to the new environment. But still, I'm not that convinced that the author would always be, you know, the winner, right?
Well,
maybe
you know,
in some ways, but they find their ways too, you know.
well, you make a point that others have made, and again, I'm not a scientific or scholarly author, but I was in the business, if you will, and I had to say that if you scratch an author, you found somebody who had a problem with a publisher. There are absolutely no happy authors that I've ever seen. Even the authors that are publishing their own work on Amazon are annoyed at Amazon. So it kind of goes with the territory. I think you make a good point. One of the things that happens, and this is sort of a subtle point in what I was just talking about, but it's more obvious to your example. The internet evaporates the container, right? Now the container before, because it was a product, would be the book. The container would be the CD, right? And those containers were manufactured. They were products you had to ship somewhere and put in a warehouse and put a price tag on. Because it's all just data. It's all just bits and bytes and ones and zeros. It can be broken down into, you know, categories just razor thin. And there is certainly an inclination to move in that direction. There's no question about it. So you may be right that they may be thinking about making available chapters. So, for example, in course packs, you know, you know, I see that happening. It's not going to happen in the world of Harry Potter because nobody's going to buy the 10th chapter of the book because all the other chapters are what really counts too. But in professional publishing, scholarly publishing, it's very likely that the article will rise in importance. The chapter, I should say, too.
Well, just to finish. In my case, I did not give up. I insisted that, you know, it's not serious. It's not like you know, you can read one chapter and you know, it was accepted. You know, and they were willing to accept that.
Well,
but I assume that does not happen every time. You know?
No, but again, I think it's a great point and a great example. And I give these kind of talks all over, and I hear about these points. And negotiation is really, that means it goes in two directions, right? It's not a negotiation if somebody tells you what to do. That's a command. And I think that many authors in the scholarly world and in the, what I'll call the business publishing world, should be aware that they do have more leverage than they had in the past, in part because you have a choice of where to go. You know, not so much in scholarly publishing, although there are journals that will take anything at this point, but in the book publishing world, you could publish that book yourself now. And while that's been true for genre fiction and that sort of thing, it's now happening in lots of other parts of the publishing environment. So I have an interview on Beyond the Book with a textbook, the author of a textbook, who's been publishing his textbook himself. He's a leader in a field of like, it's like health information metrics, okay? All the requirements around HIPAA and all the rest of it. He publishes his own textbook. He's done very well indeed, but he even plows the returns on that textbook publishing back into his own, you know, the publishing business, or he in fact donates it to his university. So it's not even about money in that point, but it's just about having that control. And part of it was the frustration he had, that you feel, and just the delays that happen in textbook publishing. So it's a good point. Sure.
So I was wondering if you had any advice for young scholars kind of just starting out, especially those in the humanities, since I noticed a lot of your talk was science, technology, and medicine.
Yeah, so much of this is about the science and STM. Humanities area, there's been some pushback, you know, because what happens is humanities really feels left out, and it feels that, again, making work available, you know, sort of all that research, they don't get the funding that the scientists have. So for all their effort to suddenly see it published online for free sort of seems wrong to them. There is now interest in so-called open access monographs. And probably if this were to happen, and again, we have an interview on Beyond the Book about this with a woman who did some research on it. It will be that the institution that wishes to publish the book. So in the past, the university press would publish a monograph. It will pay a certain fee to a publisher, and then that monograph will become freely available. So there may be some open access for books that will become possible, but it is certainly a challenge. And what's happening too is that it's a business model. The universities are buying fewer and fewer and fewer of those monographs. And if you're going to be publishing them, you need some funding for them. And again, there may be some source. The institutions themselves may decide to source, to provide the funding for that. It's a bit confusing, but there's a hope there in that. Sure.
Before we get too far away, I actually have a response to your comment. And I'd say, so I'm a librarian, and I see students using ebooks all the time, and I don't know if that's the venue that your books are being published in, but from a usability perspective, having the bibliography included in each chapter, because, like you were saying, the package itself is dissolved, is when you're accessing it digitally, it's hugely useful, especially depending on the rules that the publisher sets for download, which I'm sure you're aware that every publisher has a different percentage of the work that can be downloaded and like stored. So it's really, from the library's perspective, it's really, really frustrating for our patrons because they're all, you like reach this max percentage all of a sudden, and the bibliography's in the back, and like, it's included as like an appendix. So in terms of like citation chasing and making sure that you're understanding the work that you're accessing, that becomes like having the bibliography attached to the content becomes incredibly useful for the researcher, which I can understand, but I understand the frustration of it from your perspective as like it being packaged as individual content sold. So there's like ebooks.
Yeah, I love the term citation chasing. That really is, that's a new one for me, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, it's about the expectation that we all have from being online so much of the time. All that information is just a click away, and that's what we want. We don't really want to have to be searching for stuff. If we're reading an entry, we want to click on something and get to that Wikipedia page and do whatever else it is. I think that's true, sure.
So I was actually going to follow up on the previous question. I think what you're pointing out in terms of differences between sciences and humanities is that it's not the authors that are in charge, it's the funders. Where's this money actually coming from? It's not that the authors are pulling it out of their pockets, they're pulling it out of their research funding. So, of course, you as an author have some discretion of where to send that, but you have to get the money in the first place, and it sort of creates a catch-22 in a way as a young scholar, because you have to have some publications in order to get that grant funding. So you have to, collaborate with other people to do that, and, just in order to build up a record that is fundable, if you're even in a field where that is an option. So, the empowerment of the authors in this model is, I think, a little questionable to me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that happens in our digital age is this notion of transparency. In the past, so much was in a black box, and you contributed an article, it got published somehow, and it wound up in a library bookshelf. The digital environment just sort of pulls the curtain back and reveals all the various parts, reveals all the players that were involved in the past. They were all there before, the authors, the publishers, the funders, the government agencies, the librarians. They were all there before, but they were kind of behind the curtain. And so I think I'll take your point and I made the point, right? So funders are driving this adoption of open access models. They're driving, researchers to start to, really make their work more available, more public, and all these other ways, like ResearchGate or Twitter or whatever. So you may be right. There may be sort of the invisible hand, or the sort of, finally, the invisible strings that are manipulating all of this. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, you had mentioned that in the UK that they're well ahead of us here in terms of institutional funding for APCs, and that really hasn't been the case so far here in the States in terms of that. But I guess we're coming back to this question just where is the money going to come from these for the APCs, because I don't think, at least here, it's really happening at the institutional level at most places. And I work with library budgets, and I know I've read studies that said that if you take all the money that we're spending on subscriptions and if it were to be repurposed into APCs, for most like large research institutions, that wouldn't begin to cover a fraction of the APCs.
People are aware of this challenge. I think in the U.S. what we're seeing is the so-called green road. That's become to be an accepted route to open access, although it really creates a very dispersed and diverse environment in terms of, is it really accessible if I have to hunt around for which repository something is in? But so the green road is not, there's no fee attached, but it does require the researcher to put a preprint or some form of the article into an open repository. I guess to say to that, there is no single model right now, and that's going to add to the confusion. But you're right, all those points are absolutely fair. And people don't want to pay twice either.
Right.
They don't want to pay for a subscription and for the APC charge. Maybe one last question, because I don't want to hold up. Maybe I've gone too long. Nope. Well, I really appreciate your questions and the chance to be here. I want to thank the American University and Dania Friedman for putting all of this together, and Catherine. So thank you very much.